World War II did not begin with gunfire or bombs falling from the sky. It began with humiliation, broken promises, and a world struggling to recover from the devastation of the First World War. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending the war, but planting the seeds of a far greater catastrophe. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the conflict, stripped of its territories, limited in its military, and burdened with massive war reparations. These conditions crushed the German economy, destroyed national pride, and created deep resentment among the people. Inflation spiraled out of control, savings became worthless, and millions of Germans faced unemployment, hunger, and despair. In this atmosphere of chaos and humiliation, people became desperate for strong leadership and a return to national greatness. That desperation would soon give rise to one of the most dangerous figures in human history, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889 and moved to Germany as a young man. He was not a successful student, artist, or professional, but he was a powerful speaker with an intense passion for nationalism. After Germany's defeat in World War I, Hitler, like many others, believed that his country had been betrayed by politicians, Jews, and communists rather than defeated on the battlefield. These beliefs, fueled by propaganda and conspiracy theories, became the foundation of his political ideology. Hitler joined a small extremist group known as the German Workers' Party, which later became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His speeches attracted crowds because he offered simple answers to complex problems. Germany had been robbed of its greatness, and he promised to restore it. By the early 1920s, Hitler had become the leader of the Nazi Party. In 1923, he attempted a failed coup known as the Beer Hall Putsch, trying to overthrow the German government. He was arrested and sent to prison, where he wrote his infamous book Mein Kampf, outlining his vision of a racially pure Germany, expansion for living space, and the destruction of Jews and communists. Although the coup failed, it brought Hitler national attention. When he was released from prison, he changed his strategy. Instead of overthrowing the government by force, he would take power legally by winning elections and manipulating political systems. The Great Depression of 1929 gave Hitler the opportunity he needed. As the global economy collapsed, Germany was hit especially hard. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared to more than 6 million people. The democratic government seemed powerless, and many Germans lost faith in democracy itself. Hitler and the Nazis promised jobs, stability, and national pride. They blamed Jews, communists, and foreign powers for Germany's suffering. Through propaganda, rallies, and intimidation, the Nazis gained support. In 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he used emergency powers to eliminate political opponents, shut down free speech, and establish himself as dictator. Once in power, Hitler moved quickly to transform Germany into a totalitarian state. The Nazi Party controlled all aspects of life: schools, media, police, and even private conversations. Anyone who opposed the regime was arrested, sent to prison, or executed. Jews were stripped of their rights, businesses were destroyed, and violence against them became common. Hitler also began rebuilding Germany's military, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. He believed that Germany needed more land and resources to survive, especially in Eastern Europe. His goal was to create a massive empire that would dominate the continent. While Hitler was rising in Germany, other nations were also changing. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship. In Japan, military leaders were taking control of the government and expanding into Asia. These three powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, would soon form the Axis alliance. They shared a belief in military strength, nationalism, and expansion. They also believed that the Old World powers, Britain and France, were weak and unwilling to fight. In 1938, Hitler made his first major move. He demanded the right to unite Germany with Austria, a country with a large German-speaking population. When Austrian leaders resisted, Hitler sent his troops in. The Anschluss, as it was called, was completed without a single shot fired. Europe did nothing to stop him. Encouraged by this success, Hitler then turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, demanding territory known as the Sudetenland. Once again, Britain and France gave in, hoping to avoid another war. This policy became known as appeasement, but Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving that Hitler's promises meant nothing. Soon after, he set his sights on Poland. To avoid a war on two fronts, Hitler signed a secret pact with the Soviet Union, agreeing not to attack each other. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland using a new method of warfare called blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, airplanes, and fast-moving troops overwhelmed Polish defenses. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Within months, Hitler's armies swept across Europe. Denmark and Norway fell, followed by Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Paris was captured in 1940, shocking the world. Britain stood alone, facing the powerful German war machine. Hitler attempted to destroy the British Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain, but British pilots and radar systems held their ground. For the first time, Hitler was stopped. In 1941, Hitler made a fatal decision. He turned on his former ally and invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. Millions of German troops crossed into Soviet territory, beginning the largest invasion in human history. At first, the Germans advanced quickly, capturing huge areas and millions of prisoners, but the Soviet Union refused to surrender. Harsh winters, long supply lines, and fierce resistance slowed the German advance. The war in the East would become the bloodiest conflict of the entire war. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan was expanding rapidly. Seeking resources, Japan attacked European colonies and American territories. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a U.S. naval base in Hawaii. The attack destroyed much of the American fleet and killed thousands. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy then declared war on the United States. World War II had become truly global. The war now stretched across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Old empires that had dominated the world for centuries were being shaken to their core. Britain and France, once the rulers of vast colonial empires, were fighting for survival. Japan challenged European control in Asia. Germany sought to dominate Europe entirely. The balance of power in the world was collapsing. As the war continued, the true horror of Nazi regime became clear. Under Nazi rule, millions of Jews, along with Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others were sent to concentration camps. Many were forced into slave labor. Others were murdered in gas chambers. This systematic genocide became known as the Holocaust. It was not just a war of armies, it was a war against humanity itself. By 42 and 43, the tide of war began to turn. The Germans were defeated at Stalingrad, losing an entire army. In North Africa, Allied forces pushed back German troops. In the Pacific, the United States won key battles against Japan. Slowly, the Axis powers began to lose their grip. The fall of the old empires had begun. Germany's dream of domination was crumbling. Japan's expansion was being reversed. Even Britain and France, though they would survive the war, would never regain their old imperial power. The world was changing forever. As 1943 unfolded, the illusion of Nazi invincibility was shattered. At Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army had been surrounded by Soviet forces in a brutal winter of starvation, cold, and relentless attack. When the final surrender came in February, more than 300,000 German soldiers were lost. It was not only a military defeat, it was a psychological earthquake. For the first time, Hitler's army had been completely destroyed in a major battle. Across Europe and the world, people realized that the Third Reich could be beaten. From that moment forward, Germany was no longer marching towards victory, but fighting desperately to avoid collapse. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union began pushing westward with unstoppable force. Entire German divisions were crushed as Soviet tanks, artillery, and infantry advanced through Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland. The Red Army was fueled by rage, having witnessed unimaginable destruction inflicted upon their homeland. Villages had been burned, millions had died, and entire cities lay in ruins. For the Soviet soldiers, this was not just a war, it was revenge and survival combined. Every kilometer they gained brought them closer to Berlin, and every step carried the promise of justice against Nazi brutality. In Western Europe, the Allies prepared for the most daring operation of the war. On June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. This massive invasion, known as D-Day, was the largest amphibious assault in history. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied troops stormed heavily defended shores under machine gun fire and exploding shells. Many died within minutes of landing, but they kept moving forward. By the end of the day, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany in the West. As Allied forces pushed across France, they liberated cities and towns that had suffered under Nazi occupation for years. People came out into the streets cheering, crying, and celebrating their freedom. Paris was freed in August 1944, marking a powerful moment in the collapse of Hitler's European empire. Meanwhile, German forces were retreating on all fronts, short on fuel, equipment, and hope. Hitler, however, refused to accept reality. He ordered his armies to fight to the last man, believing that sheer willpower could still bring victory. Inside Germany, the Nazi state was collapsing. Cities were being destroyed by relentless Allied bombing. Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden burned as bombs fell from the sky. Factories were destroyed, transportation systems collapsed, and millions of civilians were left homeless. Yet Hitler continued to live in a fantasy world, hiding in underground bunkers and blaming his generals for failures. He refused to negotiate or surrender, even as the country was being torn apart. At the same time, the horrifying truth of the Holocaust was being revealed. As Allied troops moved into Eastern Europe, they discovered concentration and extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. What they found shocked the world: mountains of shoes, piles of human hair, mass graves, and gas chambers. Millions of Jews had been murdered, along with countless others. Survivors were weak, starving, and traumatized. The full scale of Nazi crimes became undeniable. Hitler's empire had not only been built on war, but on genocide. In April 1945, Soviet forces entered Berlin. The city was reduced to rubble as brutal street fighting raged. Tanks rolled through destroyed neighborhoods while artillery pounded the final defenses of the Reich. Hitler remained in his underground bunker beneath the city, surrounded by a small group of loyal followers. He was now a broken man, physically ill, mentally unstable, and completely isolated from reality. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. A few days later, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But the war was not yet finished. In the Pacific, Japan continued to fight fiercely. The Japanese Empire had conquered vast areas of Asia, but now American forces were pushing closer to the Japanese homeland. Island by island, brutal battles were fought in places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These battles showed how deadly an invasion of Japan would be. Japanese soldiers refused to surrender, and civilians were often caught in the violence. Millions more lives would be lost if the war continued this way. In August 1945, the United States made a decision that would change the world forever. A new and terrifying weapon, the atomic bomb, was used against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In seconds, entire cities were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed or injured. The sheer power of the bombs forced Japan to surrender. On September 2, 1945, World War II officially ended. The war had destroyed the old world order. Germany lay in ruins, divided and occupied. Japan was defeated and forced to abandon its empire. Britain and France, though victorious, were exhausted and economically weakened. Their colonial empires began to fall apart as nations in Africa and Asia demanded independence. The age of European dominance was coming to an end. In its place, two new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations, once allies, now stood on opposite sides of ideology and power. The world entered a new era known as the Cold War, shaped by fear, nuclear weapons, and political rivalry. The United Nations was created in hopes of preventing another global catastrophe, but the scars of World War II would never fully fade. World War II was more than a conflict of nations. It was the collapse of empires, the rise of extreme ideologies, and the greatest tragedy humanity had ever experienced. Over 70 million people died, cities were erased, entire cultures were shattered, and yet, from the ashes, a new world was born, one shaped by the lessons, sacrifices, and horrors of the war. This was the story of how Adolf Hitler rose from nothing to nearly rule Europe, and how his empire of terror was ultimately destroyed. It was the story of how the old empires fell, and how the modern world was forged in fire, blood, and determination. World War II did not just change history, it created the world we live in today.